FEMORS is the Florida Emergency Mortuary Operations Response System. It's Florida's mass fatality team, and it is administered out of the University of Florida with funding provided by the Florida Department of Health.
We're running an exercise to let our members practice what it's like to respond to a mass fatality event.
And once a year we do training so that if there is an event, we are prepared to go out. We may be called out for a portion of us. Sometimes the entire team is called out.
With this setup, we have a village here, a disaster village, where we can lay out mannequins and other recovery specimens to rehearse what it's like to recover remains from the field.
And as you can see right behind me is the morgue that has been set up, that we have set up for our training. And we do this every time we come out. We set up an entire morgue that everything that is necessary to identify a set of remains can be done in. And we have refrigerated units to keep those remains safe. And there's also control over everything so that there is no way for unauthorized personnel to be able to access our area.
When FEMORS is training, we try to prepare for every type of incident that we may be exposed to. It may be a similar situation where there's a fire or a shooting, but every incident is different because there's different people involved, there's different weather involved, different family members involved. So we try to keep core to our principles, and we're there to help the families in whatever it takes.
Nobody expects a disaster. Nobody wants a disaster, and you certainly don't want one in the community that you serve. But the unfortunate reality is that mass fatality events happen.
The one thing every disaster has in common that they have nothing in common. We have yet to go to two disasters in which we respond the same way. We jokingly say we are all members of AA, which is adapt and adjust, because there is no way to know how you are going to respond to a hurricane versus a tornado versus a crash of any kind or a fire.
Preparation, being prepared, and knowing what technology is out there to be able to help you do a job like this is critical.
So when FEMORS got together, after the first year or so, we put together a little handbook of what we hope to accomplish, what our job descriptions were. That has now evolved into something we call the Field Operations Guide, or FOG.
Our Field Operations Guide is over 600 pages, and that is essentially FEMOR's plan for a mass fatality response. There are so many moving parts that both on the anti-mortem side with setting up a family assistance center, the DPMU itself, the equipment, the roles that people have to play, the standards and best practices for actually collecting the data. This type of work is impossible to do without a plan, and it has to be a very detailed plan. It's not something that you can just kind of make up as you go along and follow the path of least resistance. The most important thing is to have the plan and be able to work the plan. This is our annual full-scale exercise. We are obligated contractually to do this once a year, and this gives us a chance to do a couple things. One is we interface with our National Guard partners, the fatality search and recovery teams who are partnered with us for most every deployment. They are our partner for disaster site recovery and human remains storage. There's a couple National Guard teams in Florida that we partner with, so this is our chance to show them how to implement forensic skills to document human remains out in the environment at the disaster site, properly document where that recovery actually occurs, train them with proper human remains handling protocols, transport protocols, and then we get them to transport the remains back to our mobile morgue.
So overall, the training exercise, there are cadavers, both real and artificial, that will be placed out in an area where there has been some sort of a disaster. And what happens is the search and recovery are the first ones out. They go out and they find, label, and collect remains, and then they start bringing them into the morgue area where there is a triage. A determination is made as to what samples should probably be taken. And each set of remains has a minder that is assigned to them, and it's that person's responsibility to bring the set of remains through the morgue and go to the appropriate stations.
So my specific role is to manage the database that we use to collect the antemortem or pre-death information from families and the post-mortem information from the remains or the victims that we find when they're recovered. Secondary to that, I'm also the logistics officer for our Victim Information Center team. So if they need equipment, supplies, that's part of my responsibility to keep them up and running. With a mass fatality incident, you don't know who the person is. So we come in and interview families. We gather the information about their loved one, and then we examine the bodies and the remains of the victims that we find, try to connect the dots to identify who this person is. The 8-page that we use has a lot of information. There's over 380 data points. Some of that information is for what we call eliminators. If you're trying to find a match to somebody, a remains or a body that you've recovered in the morgue, then you want to eliminate having to look at all of the reports. So like if somebody has a tattoo, you want to find all the family members that had mentioned their loved ones has the tattoo. So you can search and say, I want to see tattoos, and it may eliminate a whole lot of records that you don't have to look at. And you can do the same thing with the morgue records of the disaster victim packet, as we call it, when you can say, okay, show me everyone we've recovered that has a tattoo. And then you can start comparing tattoos to see if you find a possible match to begin that identification process and start connecting the dots. One of the tools that FEMORS uses in its toolbox to help identify a missing person or a victim from a mass fatality incident is DNA.
Well, DNA has come to be very important. In years past, obviously, it used to take weeks to get DNA, then it would get down to days. And as we saw in the collapse of the condo in Miami, it comes down to a matter of 90 minutes.
So the evolution of DNA technologies has really advanced. As it has been advancing, it has made all of this much, much easier. We can use much smaller samples. We can use samples that are more deteriorated than in the past. And the technologies, especially with something like rapid DNA technology, really enhances our ability to do our job in a situation like this.
The rapid DNA at this point in time gives us a very powerful technology that most people understand, that can be utilized very quickly. One of the other questions that we're often asked before we're allowed to collect a DNA sample, particularly if it's from family members, is just what are you going to do with that DNA sample? What database is it going to be plugged into? And then how are you going to protect my privacy when this is all done, and essentially destroy these genetic samples so that they're not out there. And so explaining the whole process of how this is an interconnected database, but it's just used for this instance. It's not going to be compared to criminal databases. Just putting them at ease as to how we're going to handle that type of genetic information, exactly what it's going to be used for, has led to a much greater acceptance or willingness for family members to come forward and be sampled for their genetic material.
While we're interviewing families filling out that 8-page that I mentioned, we do ask families if they would like to give a DNA sample. So we do ask, and if they are allowing us to do that, we'll send them right over to the DNA station and do a buccal swab and go ahead and be able to get that reference sample right away.
As an example, the Surfside in Miami, when the condo fell, the samples that we were taking at the beginning of the process were somewhat different than the samples we were taking towards the end because of skeletonization, insects, the condition of the remains, the level of decomposition. And so we had to make a decision on each individual that we were presented with as to how we were going to sample those remains. When they initially responded to the disaster, rapid instruments were set up immediately to start collecting DNA from the victims' families. And so by the time we were taking DNA from the remains coming out of the disaster site, They already had a full database of as many of the victims' families as possible. And that was an internal database being held within the instrument. And so as we were working and the rapid instrument was doing well with the tissues that it was being provided, or the samples, there were immediate associations of that set of remains with families, so the interviewers could then go back and call the victims' families in and interview a little bit more intensely and be able to make sure that this was an appropriate match.
As far as FEMORS goes, our team members are forensic professionals from throughout the state. Many of them work in the crime laboratory system. They're crime scene analysts with our cities and counties in Florida. Many of them are medical legal death investigators. Our forensic pathologists come to us from the Florida medical examiner system. So they're all professionals that do their work every day, and they volunteer to come to a training event like this. And then when there is a disaster or a need and they are deployed, they become University of Florida employees.
We get people who have qualifications in those forensic sciences. Our job is not to teach them how to do their job, it's to teach them what has to be done in the job, the end result, if you will. So that's where our focus is, in getting them trained in how to accomplish what they need to accomplish. And we do that in a group setting, and we do it to the best of our ability. Some people are curious about how we get into this field or why we think we have something to offer. I can only speak for myself. My leadership ability of running Pinellas County's medical examiner office, running the Gainesville medical examiner's office for many, many years, they exhibited themselves, and that's why I was selected to become the first commander of FEMORS. And it takes patience to be able to do this.
I didn't know that I really wanted to do mass fatality response, but if you get into forensic science, eventually there's going to be an incident. You're going to be able to, you're going to be called in to assist. And that's kind of what started it for me. I, on the FEMORS team, was just a regular FEMORS member. I was on the DPMU, I was then the logistics chief for a while, and now I'm the commander and director. So since 2002, we have done a lot of deployments and been to quite a few places with FEMORS.
This is something that I can do. I don't have a problem with smells or visuals, and so it's something that I can do easily. And I just feel like there's a real need to do it. It's not something that a lot of people can do, and it's just a way for me to give back to my community.
As a funeral director for the past 40 years, I've had to help a lot of families deal with the final arrangements for their loved ones. One of the reasons that I'm involved in FEMORS is because when somebody loses a loved one through some type of incident, whether it be a plane crash, a fire. We've had a lot of active shooter situations in the United States these years. If somebody got on an airplane or they went out to a nightclub and they don't ever come home, it's a lot more of a traumatic and emotional experience for them to have to go through. So dealing with this type of situation is much more important to me, and it's why I became involved in the FEMORS situation, to try to help those families dealing with a loss during that traumatic time. We bring a lot of people from different agencies, different walks of life together to try to form a cohesive group that performs well together as a team to bring some peace or some calmness into a very chaotic situation. All the different agencies that have to respond to provide either law enforcement, stuff to families, whether they need support, medications, housing. So we try to bring some peace to the families to know that their loved ones are being looked for, being cared for. So we feel it's very important to do this training and the exercises that we do every year.